The river near Umwe's village was known for its peaceful look but tricky current. It flowed gently in the morning, like a sleeping snake, calm on the surface, deadly beneath. Every morning, Obina, a quiet villager with a heart bigger than his tiny farm, would fetch water before the sun climbed too high. That day, the mist hung low over the riverbank, and the crickets had barely stopped their song. Obina carried his usual yellow container, humming a low tune. But as he reached the river's edge, his steps paused. Something strange floated toward the rocks, not a log, not a goat. It was a human hand, limp and barely above the surface. Obina's breath caught. Without a second thought, he dropped the container, stripped off his wrapper, and jumped into the cold, biting water. He didn't think of danger, disease, or spirits. He only knew someone was dying, and someone had to try. Obina pulled with all his strength, each stroke a battle against the current that tried to drag them both under. The man in the water was heavy, dressed in expensive foreign fabric, now soaked and tangled around him. His eyes were closed, face pale, lips blue. Obina struggled to hold him up, slapping the man's cheek softly as he swam, whispering prayers in his head. Villagers always said no good came from interfering with strange bodies from the river. It could be a trick from spirits or a curse, but Obina didn't believe in fear more than he believed in life. Finally, he reached the bank and rolled the man onto dry soil. He pressed his chest again and again until the stranger coughed, choking up river water, eyes fluttering open with confusion. The man's hands were smooth, unlike a farmer's, and his wristwatch sparkled even after the water tried to dim it. Obina didn't notice those things. All he saw was a man who was alive again. He pulled a wrapper over him and started a fire nearby. Life was life. It didn't matter where it came from. As the man slept, Obina sat by the fire, feeding it carefully with sticks. The morning sun had risen, touching the trees with golden fingers, and the mist had thinned out like forgotten dreams. He had no idea who the man was, no ID, no phone, just a face that looked too polished to belong to this part of the world. He looked like the people on magazine covers that sometimes flew in with second-hand clothes. But Obina didn't ask questions. He fed the man from his small bowl of soaked gari when he woke briefly, then let him sleep again. Later, he carried him to his mud hut, laid him on the straw mat, and watched over him like a brother. He didn't know that the man he had saved was Africa's richest billionaire, a man whose name opened every door, who had gone missing 2 nights earlier. That man had escaped a deadly betrayal, jumped from a yacht, and washed ashore with the world thinking he was dead. But now he was breathing again, thanks to a simple villager with no TV, no phone, and no clue what he had just done. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the heat began to dry the stranger's wet clothes. He stared on the mat, blinking as if waking from a dream that had no end. Obina offered him water, which he drank with shaking hands. But when Obina asked his name, the man looked blank. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. He held his head and groaned softly, as if the pain of remembering was too much. Then he whispered one word, Daniel. No last name, no origin, just Daniel. Obina nodded gently and didn't press further. He had seen head injuries before, coconut falls, bike crashes, and he understood the fog it left behind. All he knew was this man had nowhere else to go. So he gave him a name, a roof, and a place at his fire. Whether he was a hunter or a banker didn't matter here. What mattered was survival. In Umui's Identity was less about the past and more about what you did with today. By the third day, word had begun to travel. Villages are like giant mouths. Nothing stays hidden for long. Children who fetched water noticed the strange man near Obina's hut. Mothers at the market whispered about the foreign looking stranger. Some claimed he was a spirit in human skin. Others said he was a criminal hiding from justice. One woman said she saw gold rings in his bag, which was a lie. He had no bag. Obina ignored them all. He went about his day, farming cassava, feeding Daniel, and walking to the stream like nothing was strange. But in his heart, he wondered too. Daniel didn't speak much. He avoided looking at his reflection in water. He flinched at loud noises. And once, when a radio played nearby, Daniel froze at the sound of gunshots in a movie. Obina began to sense that this man carried heavy things inside him, not just water in his lungs, but stories, secrets, and scars that no eyes could see. One morning, while Obina was out in the bush gathering firewood, Daniel stepped out of the hut for the first time alone. He walked slowly, barefoot, across the dusty path behind the house. He watched goats nibble at leaves and touched the red earth like he was meeting it for the first time. The villagers stared as he passed, and some nodded cautiously. But one man, Pa Adigwe, the old tailor, watched closely. He'd lived in Lagos before retiring to the village and had a memory like a photo album. When he saw Daniel's face, his eyes squinted. Something clicked in his old mind, but he said nothing yet. Later that day, Pa Adigwe shuffled into his hut and pulled out a faded newspaper clipping with a man on the front page. He looked again and again, then whispered to himself, "It can't be. That's the billionaire they said died last week." He looked out his window toward Obina's hut and felt his chest tighten. Trouble might be coming, he thought. Big trouble, wrapped in a quiet man with a missing past. By the seventh day, the village no longer whispered. It questioned. It stared. Some kept their children close whenever Daniel walked by. One boy even threw a stone, calling him River Ghost. Obina scolded the boy, but new fear had now wrapped itself around the village like smoke in Hamatan. Daniel noticed it too. He barely stepped outside anymore. He spent more time sitting under the mango tree behind Obina's hut, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. At night, he would stare at the stars and sometimes cry silently. Obina heard him, but said nothing. He knew what it was to suffer in silence. He once lost his own father in the war and learned that not all pain shows on the skin. One evening, a few elders called Obina aside, speaking in hushed tones. "We don't know who he is," they said. "What if he brings soldiers or thieves? What if he's cursed?" Obina simply answered, "He drank from our river. He breathes our air. Now he's one of us." But even as he spoke, his own heart was starting to wonder, what if they were right? Inside the hut, Daniel sat alone, eyes closed, when a sharp clap of thunder, cracked the sky. And just like that, pieces returned. His hand trembled. He saw a yacht. He saw faces, one familiar, one grinning with evil. Then gunshots, the boat rocking, a body falling, then cold water, darkness. Daniel gasped and clutched his chest. The memories flooded back like angry waves. His name, his company, his betrayal. Daniel Okoye, the richest man in Africa, had been declared dead, but he was not. He was alive, hiding in plain sight in a village no one could trace. As he opened his eyes, the world felt heavier. Not just the burden of survival, but now the weight of choice. Should he reveal who he was or disappear completely and start again? He touched the beaded bracelet Obina had given him and whispered, "Not yet," because something told him the danger had not passed. It was still watching, just like the villagers. At the edge of Umueze forest, a man stood hidden behind thick banana leaves. He wore dark boots, carried binoculars, and spoke into a small device. "Target is alive. Location confirmed. Repeat, Daniel Okoye is alive." His voice was low, urgent. He had been tracking Daniel for days since he vanished from the coast. He wasn't a police officer. He wasn't a family member. He was a hired hand, paid well to clean up the mess of powerful people. Daniel's enemies weren't celebrating his death. They were making sure he stayed dead. Now that they knew where he was, time began to shrink like shadows before nightfall. The man returned to his black SUV hidden in the forest and made a phone call. "Prepare the second team. We move soon." Meanwhile, back in the village, Obina offered Daniel roasted yam with palm oil, smiling like everything was normal. But the wind shifted, the birds scattered, and somewhere deep in Daniel's bones, he felt something coming, something dangerous. 2 days later, a sleek black car rolled slowly into Umuez. It didn't belong. Its tires crunched the dry sand, drawing every eye in the village. No one in Umuez owned a vehicle, let alone one this polished. The engine purred like a lion, too confident to roar. A man stepped out, tall, clean-shaven, with a look too sharp for any farming business. He wore a tailored blue suit and dark glasses. His shoes didn't touch dust. The villagers greeted him with suspicion, but he only smiled, nodding politely and asking simple questions. "Do you know a man named Daniel? Has anyone new arrived lately?" "I'm a doctor," he claimed. "He's missing." Obina heard the rumors, but didn't go out. He didn't trust this man's calmness. It felt too smooth, too planned. Daniel stayed inside, pretending to be asleep, though his heart raced. When Obina returned later that evening, Daniel met his eyes with quiet fear. "He's not a doctor," Daniel said softly. "He's death wearing perfume." That night they slept lightly, listening for footsteps that never came, but knowing they would. Under the moonlight, Obina sat outside, roasting maize, thinking about what to do. His life had never been complicated. Just work, pray, and eat. But now he was caught in a story larger than his village. Daniel joined him quietly, staring into the fire. The crackle filled the silence until Daniel spoke slowly. "My name is Daniel Okoye. I own the company that built those roads in Lagos, the hotels, the telecom towers. I went missing because someone tried to kill me." Obina blinked, not because he was shocked, but because he didn't care about titles. He had saved a man, not a bank account. Still, the truth changed things. It meant enemies. It meant danger. It meant the simple life might be over. Obina nodded slowly, then tossed more wood into the flames. "You're safe here," he said at last, "but not forever." Daniel smiled faintly for the first time in days. In that moment, the fire between them wasn't just warmth, it was trust, a bond no riches could buy. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every sound made him sit upright, heart thumping. He knew now the men weren't far. The village was peaceful, but peace couldn't protect forever. He thought about running, just disappearing again. But then he thought of Obina. The man had given him shelter, food, and dignity, all without knowing who he was. That kind of debt wasn't paid with money, it was paid with courage. Before sunrise, Daniel stepped outside, walking to the center of the village where the old community bell stood. He rang it 3 times. People peeked from their windows. He waited. One by one, villagers emerged, curious, cautious, quiet. Then Daniel stood before them and spoke the truth. I am not who you think I am, he began. And with that, he told the entire story: the betrayal, the river, the lie, the survival. There was no applause, just silence. Then someone clapped, then another, until the whole village stood still, not as spectators, but as protectors. The man who arrived as a mystery had become one of them, but danger was still near, and Daniel knew that trust alone wouldn't be enough this time. At midnight, while the village slept under stars and palm fronds, the peace was shattered by the sound of cracking wood. 2 masked men slipped into Obina's compound, moving like shadows with silent footsteps and hard intentions. But what they didn't expect was Daniel sitting awake in the dark, gripping the machete Obina had left by the door. The moment one stepped in, Daniel swung. It didn't hit, but it startled. The attacker stumbled, knocking over a stool. The noise woke Obina, who burst out with a burning stick from the fireplace. The light exposed the faces, not villagers, outsiders, paid men. Before they could finish what they came for, neighbors began emerging from their huts. One had a hole, another a club. The strangers ran, faded into the bush, but the message was clear. Daniel's enemies had arrived. Obina's village was no longer a safe corner of the wood. It was now part of a storm much bigger than anyone they had imagined. But this time, the simple villager was no longer standing alone. The next morning, the entire village gathered beneath the old Iroko tree. Elders sat on wooden stools, hands folded, faces firm. They listened as Daniel explained everything again, this time with full truth and names. He told them about the man who had sent assassins, a business partner who had planned to take over everything by removing him. He had survived only because he jumped into the sea. I am not asking you to fight my war, Daniel said, but I had nowhere else to go. The oldest elder, Mama Ifioma, looked at him with steady eyes. When one of us is hunted, we all feel the arrow, she said. We do not send people back into the fire, but we must be wise. The decision was made. They would hide Daniel deeper into the forest, in an abandoned hunter's hut, known only to a few, until help arrived, until the danger passed. In silence, the villagers formed a chain, passing food, cloth, and supplies. No one asked for reward. They simply moved, like family. Deep in the forest, Daniel sat in the hut that now served as his shelter. It smelled of dried leaves, smoke, and earth, a place of old spirits and quiet strength. Obina had shown him how to trap small animals and purify water from the stream. They spoke little, but their bond grew louder in silence. Every evening, Obina came to check on him, bringing news and sometimes just sitting. Daniel began writing in a small notebook Obina gave him, scribbling ideas for justice, not revenge, plans for rebuilding, for returning, not with firepower, but with truth and law. He had power, even without his wealth. Power in the story of a village that chose humanity over fear. He stared at the green walls of trees that now protected him, whispering, "They saved me. Now I must save them too." Somewhere beyond those leaves, enemies still hunted. But Daniel no longer felt alone. He felt ready. And the plan was already forming, one that would change everything. From the hidden hut, Daniel wrote a letter, not one of apology or fear, but a declaration. He addressed it to the national press, to the police commissioner, and to the international board members of his company. In the letter, He revealed his betrayal, the attempt on his life, and the survival that shocked even him. He exposed the names, the plots, the stolen documents, but most importantly, he wrote about Umweze, the village that gave him life again. The letter spoke of Obina, the simple man who rescued him with no questions, and the people who protected him with no reward. When he was done, he handed the letter to a traveling pastor who visited nearby villages. Post this when you reach the city, he told him, slipping a note of explanation inside. The man nodded and disappeared with the envelope in his leather Bible. Daniel had lit the match. Now, all that was left was to wait for the flames to rise. While the world outside began stirring from the letter's arrival, Daniel didn't rest. He helped Obina mend his farm. He repaired leaking roofs for villagers. He taught the school children how to read maps and taught the tailor's grandson how to use a calculator. He gave, not with money, he had none on him, but with time and knowledge. Slowly, the village began to change. Young boys stopped throwing stones. Women who once gossiped about the riverman now brought him soup and firewood. And one day, Daniel sat under the same mango tree and wept, not from fear, but from a feeling he never knew he needed: belonging. In the city, he was king of skyscrapers, but here he was human again. That day, Obina brought him fresh cassava and said, "You've planted more in this village than any rain ever did." Daniel smiled. He had given them no gold, but still they called him rich. In the capital city, a young journalist named Adalbi read Daniel's letter. She didn't believe it at first, but the name, the details, the signature, it was real. She published the letter in the biggest paper the next morning. Within hours, the whole country was buzzing. The missing billionaire was alive, and he had exposed a corporate coup at the heart of Africa's largest business empire. The news exploded like wildfire. TV stations ran emergency reports. The president called for protection. International business leaders demanded investigations. Arrests began. The man who had tried to erase Daniel's name now faced trial. But the greatest headline of all didn't mention yachts or millions. It read, "A simple villager saved the richest man in Africa, and he chose justice over vengeance." In Umwez, the radio buzzed with the story. Children danced, elders prayed, but Obina only smiled. He already knew what the world had just found out. Riches meant nothing without honor. And Daniel? Daniel had returned to life not as a billionaire, but as a man reborn. One morning, the peaceful hum of Umweze was broken by a thunderous sound from above. Children ran out barefoot, shielding their eyes from the rising dust. Elders stood still, their walking sticks planted deep into the earth. A sleek black helicopter circled twice before slowly landing in the village clearing. It was the first time flying metal touched their red soil. As the blade slowed, men in black suits stepped out, followed by news reporters, government officials, and Daniel's former board members. The entire village stood frozen. Then Daniel emerged from his hut, not in suit or tie, but in the same wrapper Obina had given him weeks ago. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted. But Daniel raised his hand gently. He walked forward, placed both hands on Obina's shoulders and said, "This man saved me. This village gave me a new life. Everything I do now begins with them." And suddenly, Umwes was no longer a forgotten dot on the map. It became the heart of a miracle. Later that day, under the large Iroko tree, Daniel held a public meeting. Not with microphones, but with sincerity. He introduced the village to the national team who had come with him, leaders from agriculture, education, and infrastructure. He made one thing clear: Umuze would not become a tourist trap or charity headline. It would become a model. We will build clean water systems, a proper health clinic, a school with books and teachers, and every brick will be placed with your approval, Daniel promised. Government officials nodded, moved by the crowd's quiet dignity. Obina stood silently, arms crossed, watching the world twist in ways he never imagined. For the first time in generations, the village was not asking the city for help. It was being asked how to help others. What began with a drowning man was now rewriting the relationship between power and people, not with noise, but with truth. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with gold and purple, Daniel called Obina aside. From a small leather pouch, he handed him an old brass key and pointed to the last vehicle that came with the team, a brand new pickup truck with Obina's name on it, fully stocked with farm tools, seeds, and a generator. But Obina didn't look at the key. He looked at Daniel and asked, "Will you stay?" Daniel smiled. Part of me never left. And with that, they sat side by side on the same bench they had once shared roasted maize on, now watching as the village children ran through fields lit by hope. The air was still the same. The goats still wandered lazily. But something had changed forever. A simple act of kindness had cracked open a sealed wound, and what came out was not just wealth, it was legacy. Months passed, and the heartbeat of Umweze changed forever. A solar-powered school stood where goats once grazed. Children held pencils instead of sticks. The clinic treated its first mother safely through childbirth. Clean water flowed from pipes, and women no longer walked miles with clay pots on their heads. Daniel kept his promise. He didn't build mansions or factories, he built dignity. What made it even more beautiful was how the village owned it. They ran the projects themselves. Obina became the village development head, not because of wealth, but because he once chose a stranger over fear. At the entrance of the village, a carved wooden sign now stood tall. It didn't say, "Welcome to Umwes." It said, "Where kindness began again." And everyone who passed through knew they were stepping on sacred ground, ground where a poor farmer gave everything and got back the world. Daniel returned to the city only to sell off half his properties, not out of spite or loss, but because his definition of riches had changed. He built a home, not in the capital, not by the sea, but near Umwezi. It had modern touches, but kept the same mud walls, clay floors, and open-air kitchen like the one in Obina's compound. He visited often, not as a guest, but as one of them. The people didn't treat him like a king, and he didn't want them to. He taught at the school, sat on the same wooden benches with farmers, and laughed under mango trees. He wore simple clothes, walked without guards, and gave quietly. And whenever someone asked why he stayed close to the village, he'd say, "It was the only place I remembered how to breathe." One rainy afternoon, the clouds opened wide, and the entire village danced in the fields like children. The crops had grown strong, the roads no longer washed away, and music echoed from every corner. Obina stood at the edge of the farm Daniel had helped plant. He raised his hands and whispered, "We were once forgotten, but now we feed the world." Nearby, Daniel stood, soaked in the rain, laughing like a boy. The press had stopped coming, the headlines had faded, but the story lived on in every smile, every child who now read books, and every heart that remembered the man who was once drowning and the villager who didn't look away. In the end, it wasn't a rescue. It was a reunion between goodness and purpose. And from that day, whenever people asked where Daniel Okoye found his greatest treasure, he simply replied, "It wasn't in gold or land. It was in the arms of a stranger who saw me not as a billionaire, but as a man worth saving."